Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the first video quiz on antebellum slavery. Antebellum era being 1820 to 1860. This is the Antebellum South Part 1. Reading from the notes underneath. While the English did not, upon first arrival in the New World, have modern notions of race in which humankind is divided into groups associated with skin color, racism, an ideology based on the idea that some races are inherently superior to others, and entitled to rule over them, the English did view other peoples, such as the Irish, Native Americans, and Africans, as uncivilized, as less than them, as pagan, and savage and animal-like. At that time, the English, like other Europeans, tended to divide humanity between those who were either civilized or barbarian, Christian or non-Christian. Yet Africans, because of their skin color, religion, and social practices, were seen by the English as enslavable in a way that poor Englishmen were not. Slavery has existed for almost all of human history. It was central to ancient Greece and Rome and survived in Northern Europe among Germans, Vikings, and Anglo-Saxons after the Roman Empire's collapse. Although slavery existed in the 1600s in the Mediterranean and Africa, it was quite different from the plantation form of slavery that developed in the Americas, in which large numbers of slaves were brought together for very demanding agricultural labor under a single owner. The large numbers of slaves increased the dangers of slave rebellion and invited harsh discipline. Unlike in Africa, the death rate was higher here, and African slaves who became free still had a skin color that whites increasingly associated with slavery, and thus were marked as unworthy of equality in a free society. Moving on. Alright, antebellum Southern society, again reading from the notes underneath. Between 1700 and 1750, blacks went from more than 10% to almost 50% of the colony's population, and almost all were slaves. So we're talking about Virginia here. Several factors contributed to the growth of slavery in Virginia, for example. In 1705, Virginia's legislature adopted a new slave code, embedding white supremacy in law, clearly defining black slaves as property, and sharply limiting the freedom of free and enslaved blacks. Virginia is the first place historians can look to and argue that slavery had become racially oriented. Virginia had shifted from being a, quote, society with slaves, in which slavery was just one labor system among others, to a slave society in which slavery was central to the society and the economy. And this eventually becomes true of the entire nation, and over time, the South more than the North. So some characteristics of the antebellum South. Number one, it was primarily agrarian. Number two, economic power had shifted from the upper South to the lower South. The cotton gin, we can now grow cotton further away from the coast. The Louisiana Purchase, so you're talking Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, the Deep South. Number three, cotton became king. In 1860, we produced 6 million bales of cotton a year. It was 57% of all of our exports. That's how valuable cotton had become. The only thing as valuable, or maybe more, would be the slaves themselves. The South was also characterized by very slow industrialization. The market revolution happened more north and west, not so much the South. A very crude financial system dominated by the slaveocracy, the 25% of the South that owned slaves, and an inadequate transportation system. If you look at the note underneath, we relied on New England, the Ohio Valley, and Mid-Atlantic states to process their raw crops. The South depended upon them to process their raw crops. Southern per capita income was fourth in the world, behind the United Kingdom, Australia, and the North. So the North was actually the third largest economy in the world. The South was the fourth by 1860. That's how valuable slavery was to both the North and the South. The slaves would pick the cotton, the North would manufacture it in their textile mills. And don't forget, Wall Street also made money off of this, selling insurance to the slave owners and being middlemen in the slave trade. Alright, so some breakdown of Southern society. So we have a slaveocracy, the plantation owners. That was about The slavocracy plus the plain white folk, the yeoman farmers, would be about 6 million. So if the yeomanry was about 75% of the population, that leaves about 25% that was the slavocracy. So we're talking a very broad definition of yeoman here. All right, and you had about 250,000 free blacks down south, and by 1850, 3.2 million slaves. So if the total U.S. population was 23 million, and there were 9.25 million people in the South, they were 40% of the population. All right, so that's the breakdown of 6 million white people, 3.75 around black people, 3.2 million slaves. Of the 6 million white people, 1.5 million were involved in a family that owned slaves, 25%. So 75% of the South never owned a slave. All right, moving on. All right, antebellum Southern economy. All right, so if you look at this map here, you can see short fiber cotton was king, able to grow away from the coast in the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and Louisiana, and even Arkansas, and into Texas. Short fiber cotton. You had some corn grown up in the upper southern states, all right, and you had some tobacco in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia and North Carolina, but for the most part, it was short fiber cotton. You also, if you look down by New Orleans to the west of it, you'll see some rice plantations. There weren't many of them, and also along the coast, there weren't many, but man, were they rich. All right, looking at the notes underneath the slide here. By the mid-18th century, there were 3 distinct slave systems in British North America. Tobacco-based plantation slavery in the Chesapeake, okay, Virginia. Rice-based plantation slavery in South Carolina and Georgia. You see the kind of aqua blue there. Where was I? And non-plantation slavery in New England and the Middle Colonies. This is again by the mid-18th century, the 1750s. The tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, where nearly half of the region's population in 1770 were slaves, was the largest and oldest of the 3. Extending deep inland, slavery in Virginia existed on large plantations and many small farms. Slavery had created the Chesapeake elite, a landed gentry who dominated the region's society and politics in conjunction with merchants in the tobacco trade and lawyers defending the interests of slaveholders. So we're a little bit before the antebellum era in talking about this. Slavery transformed Chesapeake society into an elaborate hierarchy of degrees of freedoms on the spectrum of freedom. Large planters, plantation owners at the top, lesser planters and land-owning yeomen below them, and at the bottom a large population of indentured servants, tenant farmers, convicts, and slaves. The rice plantation system of slavery that developed in South Carolina and Georgia first relied on Indian slaves, some of whom the colony exported, along with deerskins and furs. Some tribes, like the Creeks, first participated in the Indian slave trade, starting wars with other tribes just to secure captives for the trade. There's a little irony there. But the Creeks and other Indian tribes, fearing enslavement and other English abuses, rebelled, and this encouraged Carolina colonists to turn elsewhere, African slaves, for their labor force. Rice cultivation in the low country of South Carolina prompted the importation of African slaves there and led to a growing racial divide between whites and blacks. South Carolina was the first colony to have a black majority in the whole colony itself, and eventually the state. By the 1730s, when North Carolina became its own colony, 2/3 of its population was black. Indigo, a crop used for a bluish-purplish dye, also became a staple crop there in the 1740s and was cultivated on slave plantations. Africans, familiar with the crop at home, actually taught the colonists how to grow rice. As opposed to the Chesapeake, where slaves worked constantly in gangs, slaves on the rice plantations worked in the task system, assigned daily jobs which, once completed, gave them time for leisure or crops of their own. Rice cultivation also developed in Georgia, founded in 1733 by philanthropists led by James Oglethorpe, a wealthy reformer who favored the abolition of slavery. At first, Georgia didn't allow slaves. Oglethorpe wanted to create a colony in which the worthy poor of England could find economic opportunity in the colonies. The British government wanted the colony as a defensive barrier against the Spanish and their Indian allies in Florida. Although the colony initially banned liquor and slaves, many of its settlers wanted both, and by the 1740s colonists were appealing for the English liberty of self-government in order to hold slaves. In 1751, Georgia's proprietors, the business elite, surrendered the colony to the Crown, which repealed the ban on slavery and liquor. Georgia quickly came to resemble South Carolina, with large rice plantations supporting a wealthy planter class that dominated the colony. Compared to the plantation areas, New England and the middle colonies in the north were mostly areas of small farms where slavery was not central. Slaves were only a small percentage of the population, and even wealthy families rarely owned more than one slave. Slaves worked as farm labor, in artisan shops, on the docks, and as personal servants. Slaves in the North, however, sometimes had more legal rights than their southern counterparts. In New England, slaves could not be severely physically punished. Slaves could bring suits in court, mum bet, and slave marriages were recognized. A significant number of slaves were present in New York and Philly, although many employers of slave labor turned to wage labor in the years before the American Revolution. So that's a little pre-antebellum era context for the eventual development of slavery. Moving on.